it was known for a couple of years before it was published. So it wasn't until it was published that people could examine the evidence. So Adam Clarke's commentary deals mostly with textual issues or translation issues. So it wouldn't have bothered me in the least if Joseph Smith had learned something from one of the many commentaries that were available in that time, including Adam Clarke's. If he had learned something from that was a better way of looking at the text or something like that, why not? But it didn't but it didn't happen. So for me, this wasn't an issue. It was not an issue of trying to somehow defend the faith or be an apologist to do this. I just examined all of the ones that were invoked, and none of them work, in my opinion.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I have joining me today scholar Kent Jackson, although Kent unfortunately has not been able to get his camera working, so we won't be able to see him today, but we can still hear him. And we're going to have a discussion on Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, understanding the JST, and then the second part of the interview, we're going to be confronting and discussing the Adam Clarke controversy and the claims that did Joseph Smith utilize and borrow a commentary by Adam Clarke, and Ken Jackson's done a lot of work on that as well. And I'll also promote a couple of books. I have yours, Understand Joseph Smith's Translation of the Bible. And then this one is the Book of Moses and the Translation of the Bible. And Ken, I'll just do a very quick bio, and then if you want to add anything else to your biographical or scholarly background, you can do that. But I have here that Kent P. Jackson is an emeritus professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young's University. He earned his bachelor degree in ancient studies at BYU, and then received both his master's and PhD degrees in ancient Near Eastern studies from the University of Michigan. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was converted to the gospel as a young man in 1968 and have tried ever since then to be a disciple of Jesus Christ and to use my life in his service. And how
old were you whenever you joined? Not to work out what your age is, but
I was 19 years old. I was born and raised in the church. All of my great-great-grandparents joined the church, and so my family has a long history in the church. But when I was 19, I underwent a conversion process that changed my life and made me want to be a Latter-day Saint and made me want to have the gospel in my life.
Gotcha, that's really cool. And you've got some impressive credentials there in Bible and ancient Near Eastern studies. So when did you get interested in Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible?
Before I went on my mission, I was not motivated academically at all. But while I was on my mission, something happened to my brain, and I came back wanting to be an academic and wanting to study the history and the scriptures of the church academically. And so I began studying Hebrew then, and throughout my experience as an undergraduate at the University of Utah and then at Brigham Young University, I studied Hebrew and the ancient Near East and went to graduate school, got a PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies and Hebrew Bible. But it wasn't until and I joined the BYU faculty in 1980, and it wasn't until the mid-90s that I became involved with the study of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, and it was kind of an amazing circumstance. BYU, because of some contacts that some BYU people had with the Community of Christ, which was then called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we were invited to prepare a transcription of all the original Joseph Smith translation manuscripts. And I was involved in managing that process. And so we had access to the manuscripts of the Joseph Smith translation, which were located in the archives in Independence, Missouri. And we sent out a crew from BYU to scan and photograph all of the manuscript pages. And for 6 years, my really bright and eager student assistants and I worked on preparing a transcription of every written line in all of the manuscripts. And that was published in, I can't remember when that was published, late 90s. And that was the beginning of my involvement with the study of the Joseph Smith translation.
Okay. And how many pages is the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible manuscript?
Altogether, there were 446 pages, and they were written on what was called foolscap paper, which is paper that is about, when it's folded, the individual pages are about 7.5 inches by 13 inches. So what we call in the U.S. Legal size, and written from north to south and east to west. The paper was expensive, and so they used every possible inch of the pages. So altogether, 446 pages. Part of that was an early draft, later made obsolete by the creation of final drafts. And so altogether, the complete manuscript is, I think, something like 330 pages.
Okay.
And the transcription that we prepared now is now on the Joseph Smith Papers website. So everybody in the world has access to that now. And since my work on it, the manuscripts have been rescanned at a much higher resolution, and they're all available on Joseph Smith Papers website. So everybody has access to all the writing on the original manuscripts.
Right. And Joseph Smith's Bible translation manuscripts, they contain either the new text, which Joseph Smith added to the Bible, or some of the revisions he made to certain passages. Is that right?
All of it.
All of it together.
All of it.
Excellent. So we know that Joseph Smith, he translated the Book of Mormon from April to the end of June 1829. Then it was published in 1830. The church was reorganized April 6th, 1830. And very soon after, he started the Bible translation. Could you talk about the timeline of him starting the Bible translation?
Yeah, the first page of the manuscript has written on it June 1830. So we know the starting date. And we don't exactly know all the circumstances. It was a whole new revelation of new material, very unlike the other revelations that Joseph Smith was receiving at the time. So it begins with what we now call Moses chapter 1, which is a text that we call the Visions of Moses. That's the beginning of the Joseph Smith translation. And it was very much unlike the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, in which the Lord was speaking to church members about revealing new doctrines and dealing with how to manage the church and things like that. This revelation from June 1830 was a narrative of Moses in having visions of God and then Satan appears to him, tries to derail him, and then another vision of God. And then the new translation of the Bible proceeds on the same manuscript pages after that revelation. So that was the beginnings. And the process goes until July of 1833, when the prophet had his scribe, Frederick G. Williams, right at the end of the manuscript, finished July 2nd, 1833. And on that same day, the First Presidency wrote to the church members in Missouri and said, today we finished the new translation of the Bible. And after that, there was no discussion whatsoever of translating anymore, but of getting it published. So we know the beginning month, June 1830, and we know the end day, July 2nd, 1833. And for dating things in between, we have various clues along the way.
Okay. And you've referenced in, your work and in presentations you've given that the Lord refers to Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible as a translation. But how are we to understand that word? And are there any assumptions or maybe misconceptions that Latter-day Saints have about what Joseph Smith was doing in his translation of the Bible?
Let's talk about the word first, and then you can remind me about the rest of the question.
That's fine.
I don't think we need to run away from the word translation. It's in English, so obviously it's not in the original language, so it's a translation. But the word translation in Joseph Smith's generation had a much broader meaning than it has today. Today we use it almost exclusively for conveying from one language to another language. But in contemporary dictionaries, American dictionaries from the time of Joseph Smith, translation included a broad range of meanings, including getting transferred in one's job, or changing, or conveying from one place to another place, and things like that. So it's in that sense that it's a translation. Now, obviously, there's no hint in it that Joseph Smith turned to original languages to do it. So it's not the translation from Hebrew and Greek. A better word for it would be revision, because it's the revision of a previously created text. Right. But translation works fine as long as we understand it that way.
Yeah, because I think I grew up, and I think a lot of members of the church, with the view and the assumption and the narrative we were presented with is, we believe in the article of faith in the Bible as far as is translated correctly. And the Book of Mormon talks about that there's many plain and precious truths which have been lost from the Bible, and that Joseph Smith in his Bible translation is restoring some of these plain and precious truths and almost restoring what it said on the ancient Bible manuscripts. What would you like to say about that view, if someone were to say that that's what the jest is, that he's restoring what was written anciently in some of these biblical texts?
Yeah, well, even in the article of faith, the word translated in the clause "translated correctly" really means transmitted from the earliest dictation of an ancient prophet to his scribe, all the way up into modern times. So that's really how we should understand the eighth article of faith.
Right, all the transmission of copies of copies being passed on as well.
Yeah. Now, Joseph Smith never tells us that he's restoring ancient text. You're right when you say that that's always been our core assumption, that he was restoring things that had been lost from the Bible. He doesn't say that, but what he makes clear in the things he did was that he felt instructed by God, both instructed and inspired by God, to go through the Bible and make a revision of it according to the inspiration and the other tools that he had available to him. And so I think we hurt ourselves if we assume more than what the prophet tells us on this, and more than what the manuscripts tell us, that he was restoring things that had been lost from ancient manuscripts. I like to look at it this way. I think there are places in the Joseph Smith translation where he's restoring passages or words that were once in the Bible. But I think he's also restoring things that took place that may never have been written in the Bible. Let's look at, for example, there are many places in the New Testament, in the Gospels, where Jesus is interacting with friends and foes alike, and the Joseph Smith translation adds additional words or even additional paragraphs of context that tell us what led up to the discussion, what led up to Jesus's words. I don't know if those were ever in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but I think it's perhaps more likely in some instances that those were things that were said and done that were never recorded and that are now revealed to us in the last days to help make the New Testament text more readable. The same thing is maybe true with the two big editions in the book of Genesis, the visions of Moses that we have in Moses chapter 1 of the Pearl of Great Price, and then the Enoch chapters that we have in Genesis. I don't know if those were ever in the Bible. I believe that they are true. I believe that they happened. Maybe they were in other books, or maybe they never were in books at all. So, in any case, we look at it as a new revelation that comes to God, from God to us in the latter days to bless us at this period of history.
Okay. So yeah, you've alluded to the Book of Moses being probably, I've heard it described as a revelatory expansion upon the text of Genesis, and maybe it's an ancient text. You're saying maybe it was originally in the Bible, or maybe it wasn't. And you talk about Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible being his revision of the Bible. Maybe you can go through, maybe just in bullet points, what are some of the different revisions we see, and how much would we say is revisions which seem to be inspired by revelation versus the prophet just making some practical or logical corrections?
I'm not going to answer that question because I really can't tell what was in the Lord's mind. But let's look at it as a spectrum. Say on one side, we have pure revelation of words from God. And I believe that that's what we have in Moses chapter 1, for example, the visions of Moses. The original manuscript of that has very, very, very few tiny edits in it. It shows every evidence of having been dictated out of the mouth of the prophet Joseph Smith to his scribe Oliver Cowdery, who writes it all down as it streams out of the lips of Joseph Smith. And in that case, I believe that, and then later on the Enoch revelations, same thing with them. I believe that those were revealed in words, not just in thoughts, but in words, so that we could have those in pure text. Now, so we have that kind of material. I call that material new text. That is text that does not have a biblical counterpart. And those are the two best examples, but there are all kinds of other little chunks of new text in the Gospels and elsewhere. And then we have...
Oh, sorry, I was going to just ask, is there any evidence that Joseph Smith might have used his seer stone during the early parts of the Joseph Smith translation, or do we not have any sources or documents to support that?
There's no evidence whatsoever that he did, and we do have an eyewitness Orson Pratt, who asked him if he did, and the prophet told him no. So I would say the answer to that is no. And then
were the mechanics sorry, Kent, were the mechanics just Joseph Smith had a Bible out in front of him and a scribe sitting across from him, and as he's going through, he's either dictating by revelation or making revisions to passages?
I think you've described it well. I think I can envision Joseph Smith with the Bible in front of him on the table, and just dictating words. Now, we'll talk about the small revisions in a minute, but I think on these big parts, the prophet didn't even have to have the Bible open when he revealed the visions of Moses or the Enoch material, 4,500 words of new text about Enoch that really has no counterpart in the Bible. So he dictates those to his scribes, and the scribes write down. They don't know. The scribes are writing. This is hard work. The scribes are writing as fast as they can while the prophet's dictating as slowly as he can do it so the scribes can keep up. And they're writing down. They don't know if he's reading out of the text or if he's just revealing new words because they're busy looking at their pages. Now, for the smaller changes, the prophet did start with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, basically, and work his way through clearly with the Bible in hand. And the Bible that he used still exists today. So clearly with the Bible in hand, he reads along in the text until he wants to make a change, dictates the change to his scribe, and the scribe writes it down. Now, back to your earlier question, how much is Joseph Smith just making practical changes and how much is revelation? So on the one hand, I think we have these new texts that are clearly revelatory. And then on the other hand, we have hundreds of places where the prophet made small changes, inconsequential changes, like changing ye to you and things like that. And I think it's a fair question to say, did Joseph Smith need to be inspired to make each and every one of those little changes? And the answer is probably no. I think the Lord gave him a broad instruction to make the Bible better and more accessible. And along the way, he revealed large chunks of new material, small chunks of new material, and hundreds of revised readings that make the text better. So along the way, if he finds a ye and he wants to change it to you, was he inspired in that particular change? I doubt it, but I don't worry about that. And also, those kinds of changes were made very inconsistently in the text. There's still more ye's in the text than there are you's in the text.
It would take you a long time to fix every single ye. I think you also talked about what to know. I always wondered what that meant as a missionary, I what or we what. So he's modernizing some of these archaic words just to make it more understandable.
Well, that's a fun case because what means to know, K-N-O-W. So along the way, they changed a bunch of those, and then his scribe wrote on the manuscript, change what to know every time it appears. So that way he didn't have to pause at every what. He gave instructions for future printers and editors to change what to know. And the past tense of what is wist, W-I-S-T. And he changed some of those. Some other ones he overlooked and didn't change.
Okay.
But I would say, and I've always believed that the modernizing of the language, even though it was done inconsistently, shows me that the prophet Joseph Smith was really not attached to the King James translation like others in the church have been. and that he was happy with the idea of getting the Bible into more contemporary English.
Okay, so some revisions is modernizing some of the language. Some of it is providing maybe context as well, as well that he's receiving revelation. I think you've also talked about that maybe certain problematic or contradictory maybe passages he's tried to harmonize. For example, like how Judas dies, or his revision on like can man see God. Do you want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think so. In my book, Understanding Joseph Smith Translations of the Bible, I have several chapters in it that deal with what I call guiding instincts. Now, the prophet didn't tell us what he was doing, so all we can do is look at the end result and deduce from that what was motivating him. And among his guiding instincts were to clarify and to correct doctrinal statements that were incorrect, correct historical things that didn't work. When Joseph Smith came to "No man has seen God at any time," he knew that that was incorrect because he had had experience with seeing God. In addition to that, the Old Testament is full of examples of other people seeing God as well, and so is the New Testament. So he corrects that, and it appears again in one of John's letters later in the New Testament. He corrects it there as well. So among his guiding instincts is to correct doctrinal errors. And Old Testament example, we have God hardening Pharaoh's heart and things like that. Those kinds of things were changed universally.
Or women being told to keep silent in the churches. I believe he revised and corrected that to not to rule in the churches.
Yes, thankfully, we can all be thankful that he made that change.
Okay. So some of these could be inspired revisions, and then you're open to maybe some of the modernizing of certain words. This could just be Joseph using either his instincts or sort of just making practical adjustments as well. But it could be a mixture. It's not always necessarily one. He was either fully inspired or not inspired during the Bible revision.
Yes, I would not want to draw the line anywhere, and also it is clear that God endorses the product. So whether Joseph Smith just uses common sense on things, after all, he was a prophet, or whether God revealed exact words to him shouldn't matter to us at all, because God clearly endorses the Joseph Smith translation in several places in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Right. So I've heard the JST being referred to by a lot of members of the church or faithful scholars as Joseph's inspired commentary on the Bible. And from listening to you, I know you don't like it being referred to as an inspired commentary. Why don't you like that term and prefer it being referred to either as his translation or revision of the Bible?
It's definitely not a commentary. A commentary is in the voice of somebody outside of the text. Every commentary is in the voice of somebody outside of the text. This is not the Joseph Smith translation. None of it is the voice of somebody outside of the text. It's all internal to the text, and so he's revising existing text. He's not making comments about it.
Okay. And do you think as well that Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible was really important because it led to Joseph Smith, as he's going through the Bible and he's encountering passages that he's receiving revelation, he's inquiring about them, and that led to restoring many doctrines or many plain and precious truths?
Yeah, I would say to anybody, look in the table of contents at the beginning of the Doctrine and Covenants and start with the date June of 1830 and go to July 1833 and see how much of the Doctrine and Covenants was revealed during that time. Something like 2/3 of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants came during the time that the prophet was working on the Bible translation. And some passages can be traced, or some Doctrine and Covenants revelations can be traced to the work that was being done on the Bible translation. But there are probably many more things where questions came up in the course of the translation that caused the prophet to seek revelation. One thing that is really striking is the chronological correspondence between the revelation of the Enoch material in the Joseph Smith translation and the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants that pertain to building Zion. This may be the best example. We have a whole story revealed in the Joseph Smith translation about how a community, great prophet Enoch and his community, how they deal with struggles with the outside world, internal efforts to create Zion, and then finally create Zion on righteous principles. And what do we get immediately after that in the revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants? We have God telling the saints to create Zion and wonderful revelations about how to bring that about. The timing there is just perfect. The story of people who did it in the past comes first, and then the Lord says, okay, now you do it.
That's really fascinating.
And then the other great convergence, of course, is the revelation of the degrees of glory explicitly coming out of the translation of John chapter 5, verse 29.
Right. No, because I've heard the criticism that some people criticize that Joseph Smith's translation, as in like the manuscript, doesn't contain that much of him restoring plain and precious truths. But when you think about it, the JST was sort of this springboard to revelation, and him restoring many plain and precious truths through so many revelations, as you outlined in the Doctrine and Covenants as well. So it seems like that was probably one of its purposes as well, and many of Joseph Smith's revelations that we have in the Doctrine and Covenants are restoring plain and precious truths lost from the Bible.
Sure. Excellent. And again, a big chunk of the revelations came during that period of time. And the revelations came sporadically. Some came when the prophet when people came to the prophet and said, can you get a revelation for me for what the Lord wants me to do? But most of them came rather spontaneously. And so the prophet doesn't plan, okay, I'm going to get revelations on Sunday. He doesn't put that on his calendar. But his history shows that working on the translation was something consistent that they kept working on. And on a few occasions in the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord says, get back to work on the translation.
Right. So yeah, if it weren't for Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, not only would we not have the Book of Moses text and all of the revisions that Joseph Smith made to the King James Bible, but we also wouldn't have so many of our revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants. So it really was an important work that he was engaged in.
Indeed.
Okay, so I want to ask you a couple of questions because we've touched on the Book of Moses and the Book of Enoch. Maybe I'll start with, so I had Jeff Bradshaw on about a year ago, and we went over some correspondences between Joseph Smith's Book of Enoch, which is 2 chapters in the Book of Moses, and he was showing different correspondences to ancient Enoch texts, many of them being discovered after Joseph Smith's Book of Moses, like 2nd and 3rd Enoch, Mandean Enoch, and the one with the most correspondences was the Book of Giants, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and not just like in thematic similarities, but even some of the specific wording, things like referring to Enoch as a lad or a wild man, or talked about like the roaring of wild beasts, and a named character called Mahijah or Mahuja also being in the Book of Giants. Have you looked deeply into the Book of Enoch, and what do you make of the connections to some of these ancient texts?
I have never involved myself in that discussion at all, so I can't help you with that at all. It's something that I've just never paid too much attention to. I know Jeff has created a flourishing enterprise of examining. Jeff and others, going, of course, back to Hugh Nibley, have created a flourishing enterprise of examining those parallels. But that's just not something that I've ever been engaged in. So I don't have anything to say about that.
Okay, that's fine. I wanted to ask a couple of maybe more critical questions that someone might have about the Book of Moses. So, you know, the consensus of Bible scholars is that the Old Testament is made up of 4 different textual traditions or authors: the Y source, Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, and Deuteronomist source. And it's believed by the consensus of Bible scholars that Genesis 1 and 2 are 2 different creation accounts by 2 different authors, the EMP source. So someone might bring up that, does Joseph Smith in the Book of Moses not seem to combine these 2 different creation accounts into one, sort of meshing them together? And does this challenge Joseph Smith's inspiration? And he only combined these 2 creation accounts because he didn't know about biblical scholarship and challenge undermining if he was in fact receiving revelation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it appears there's no question about the fact that we have 2 separate creation accounts. The first one is starts with Genesis chapter 1 and goes 3 verses into chapter 2, and the rest is the second one is chapter 2. There's no question that they are 2 different tellings of the story of the creation. The first one deals with the 7 days of creation, and the second one focuses mostly on Adam and Eve and their relationship with the earth and things like that. It's a good question, and I suspect that those 2 texts do show evidence of separate authorship, whatever that means. But we have those same 2 accounts in the record of Abraham, who was 700 years or so before Moses. So I like to view that account, whatever its original origin, as being the standard creation account. That is, those 2 accounts together provide the standard creation account, kind of a systematic, symbolic account of the progress of God's creative works through 7 periods of time, and then focus on Adam and Eve and their relationship with the rest of the world. And so for some reason, God has chosen to teach us about the creation that way, and I think it's a very effective way to teach it, unless we do as fundamentalists do and believe that those days have to be 7 24-hour time periods and things like that, which the text doesn't suggest at all. So we have it as early, we have that telling of the creation as early as Abraham's time in the Book of Abraham. So in the Joseph Smith translation, we have Moses receiving these visions of God and God explaining his creations. And then God says to Moses, I'm going to teach you about the creation of the heavens and the earth. And then immediately goes into the equivalent of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so I think, and then in the Joseph Smith translation, which we have in the Book of Moses there are not major changes to either of the 2 creation accounts. The big contribution to Joseph Smith translation is not in those accounts, but in what precedes them, and then especially in the teaching about the early experiences of Adam and Eve and their children that we have in immediately following the creation accounts. So I would say what we have there is God's telling of the creation account to Moses at the beginning of the Genesis record, just like we have a telling of the same story to Abraham from a previous generation. And there may be other tellings of it in other scriptures that we no longer have. So I'm not bothered by the fact that we have those two accounts together being presented in the context of God teaching the creation to Moses at the beginning of the Genesis text.
Okay. And do you have any quick thoughts? I've listened to some Christian apologists try to defend that, oh no, maybe it's just one big creation account, but Genesis 1 is all about sort of like the days of creation and the creation of humans, male and female. And then chapter 2, that's actually more specifically to do with the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. And they could be joined together as one creation account. What's your quick thoughts on that?
Well, that's not incorrect, the way you described it there, but I think those two accounts do show evidence of separate authorship or separate origin at some other time. But it is true that the first account gives the big overview, and then the second account is a focus on Adam and Eve. There's no question about the fact that that's the case. It's clear that the book of Genesis shows evidence of different strains of authorship contributing to the book. Nothing wrong with that. The Book of Mormon does as well.
Are you sort of positive, if I'm understanding correctly, that these two ancient text traditions of creation may have stemmed back anciently, perhaps being in either the Book of Moses or the Book of Abraham, or that God just inspired Joseph Smith in his revision and revelation on the Book of Moses to, have them together as one, the way they were?
No, I think, like I said, I like to call it the two combined. I like to call them the standard creation account. And for some reason, God, at different times in history, revealed the story of the creation that way. The first being an overview, the second being a focus on Adam and Eve. And so the Joseph Smith translation really doesn't add or subtract to the discussion of ownership. But in this case, what it does say is that what we have in Genesis 1 and 2 is God's revelation of the creation to Moses. And by the way, assuming that it's true that the book of Genesis does contain material originally coming from different sources that smart editors later put together, that says nothing about the truth of the text. It just says something about the history of the creation of the text.
Okay. One other criticism of the Book of Moses, and particularly, not so much the Garden of Eden account, but after they're departed from the garden, that Adam and Eve, receive and are taught the gospel and are taught about the atonement of Jesus Christ and faith, repentance, and baptism. And what would you say to someone who says that, Joseph Smith is putting in New Testament sort of anachronistic elements into his Book of Moses, that none of those things existed in Old Testament times?
I would say that those people who say that are wrong. I think that in my mind, the Joseph Smith translation does two things that make it so indispensable. The first is to bear testimony of Jesus Christ. From the very first manuscript page, it bears testimony of Jesus Christ in a very big way. The second is it shows that the Christian gospel was always the true gospel and the true plan of salvation. And so the critics are correct that the Joseph Smith translation turns Adam and Eve into Christians, but we should rejoice that we know about that. So that's the single greatest revelation in the Joseph Smith translation, in my opinion, is the antiquity of the Christian gospel, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. And so we have Adam, Eve, Enoch, Noah, Moses, Abraham, all turning out to be Christians. We celebrate that knowledge. That's the great contribution of the Joseph Smith translation. And we have already in the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis, in the parts that we have in the Book of Moses and the Pearl of Great Price, we have the first principles and ordinances of the gospel taught repeatedly in these ancient texts. So that's a great thing to celebrate and rejoice about, that we know that. And that may, I asked, we can ask our Christian friends, why would that bother you that people in ancient times had the gospel of Jesus Christ taught to them? Why not? Why just thousands of years into human history do we have the revelation of the mission of Jesus Christ in the scriptures? So this is a wonderful contribution that the Joseph Smith translation makes.
I agree with you there. And it really resonates with me that if there is this gospel plan that's centered on the atonement of Jesus Christ and faith, repentance, baptism, that would have been given to Adam and Eve from the beginning and not centuries later. And one last question or point on the Book of Moses before we get to Adam Clarke. Would you say the Book of Moses sort of solidifies or doubles down on the historicity of Adam and Eve? Because I know there's some Bible scholars, or certainly critics of the Bible, who would see the Genesis account of either being like an ideological myth, and maybe some of this could be allegory or fable, and there still could be some elements of the Garden of Eden that could be symbolic versus literal. But would you say the Book of Moses does sort of double down on a literal historical Adam and Eve?
Oh, most definitely. I don't think it answers all of the questions that people want to know, but it does make it clear. There's an Adam, there's an Eve. They are the progenitors of the human family. They had the gospel revealed to them. So, yeah, it makes it clear that there's no wiggle room there for Latter-day Saints about the existence of Adam and Eve. The creation accounts, the Garden of Eden accounts, full of symbolic stuff that we don't understand. But we do know that at the end of all that process, Adam and Eve found themselves in a fallen world that we're still in. But at the same time, God sends them out into a fallen world. And then at the same time, he reveals to them the gospel of Jesus Christ, so they know how they and then we can live in a fallen world and still be made whole. That's a marvelous story.
Okay. Well, I think this has been a good summary so far on what the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible is, the type of revisions, and good discussion on the Book of Moses. So I want to transition next to talk about was Joseph utilizing any external sources, and we talk about the Adam Clarke commentary. So in a presentation you sort of addressed what were some sources that Joseph was consulting during his translation of the Bible. So do you want to maybe list what some of those are?
Yeah. So I believe that the Lord instructed Joseph Smith to make a revision of the Bible. The Lord provided a great deal of revelation in the process. We've talked about some of the major revealed texts within it. The Joseph Smith would not be in a position. The Joseph Smith translation is not like the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon was a pre-existing text. It existed before Joseph Smith. The Joseph Smith translation is a process of the prophet Joseph Smith, divinely called to go through the Bible, reveal new things, correct errors, and things like that. So in that process, he's going to bring into it some things that he knows. And an example that I often give is the word conversation. So the word conversation in the King James Bible does not mean conversation. It means conduct or behavior. And the prophet changed that in several places. Now, did he need revelation to do that, or had he already learned from some preacher or from mom and dad or from any other source that the word conduct really does, or conversation really doesn't mean conversation, it means behavior or conduct? If the prophet already knew that, of course he would change that when he came to that in the King James Bible, which he did. He had already had revelations. He was receiving revelations during the time that the translation was made. So, of course, he would incorporate those kinds of changes into the text. One example is that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul adds to, or Joseph Smith adds to Paul's discussion the word telestial world, because the prophet had already received a vision which he was taught of a celestial kingdom, a terrestrial kingdom, a telestial kingdom. Paul only mentions the first of those. Joseph Smith adds telestial to Paul's list. So that's a case where he had learned something previously by revelation. So of course, when he comes to that, he's going to fix that. We also know that he draws material from elsewhere in the Bible. So there are things that he changes in one of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and he's inspired to change it there in certain ways. Then he goes back and changes it in one of the other gospels. But there's more disharmonization going on than there is harmonization going on between the gospels, but there is harmonization that clearly goes on. So one JST text is suggesting things for changing another JST text. We know that he drew material out of the Book of Mormon. The Isaiah changes that are in the JST were taken out of the Book of Mormon. I think when he got to certain chapters in Isaiah, he told his scribe, Frederick G. Williams, copy the Book of Mormon Isaiah, this Book of Mormon Isaiah chapter onto the JST text. So we know that happens. So the big question is he drawing information from other sources, non-scriptural sources, and things like that? And so some years ago, my friend and colleague, Thomas Wayment, was looking into the sources for some of the small textual changes that Joseph Smith made. And Tom concluded that the prophet drew material from the Bible commentary of Adam Clarke. Adam Clarke was a Scottish theologian, wrote a big Bible commentary that was very common on both sides of the Atlantic during the lifetime of the prophet Joseph Smith. In his research, he identified something like 30 different passages that he believed were influenced by Joseph Smith reading Adam Clarke. I looked at every one of those very, very carefully. I looked at about 250 other changes Joseph Smith made very, very carefully. And I do not believe that there's any evidence that Joseph Smith ever saw or used Adam Clarke's commentary.
And you've got a very good article, which I'll link. It's called Some Notes on Joseph Smith and Adam Clarke, and maybe we could talk about a couple of examples, but it goes through it very, very thoroughly. Now, listening to you, you initially didn't find it necessarily problematic if Joseph Smith had have consulted a Bible commentary, and I know in Doctrine and Covenants 88, the Lord says to seek out the best books, Seek Learning by Study and also by Faith, and Doctrine and Covenants 9, sort of invokes this studying out in your mind part of the revelatory process. So initially, were you sort of accepting of their scholarship?
Yeah, until I saw it.
And it seems like everyone was as well. Like, I think because was it summer 2020? It was around that time. I remember listening to a critical podcast at the time, going over it, and it seems like it was just accepted, the consensus of faithful and unbelieving scholars, that Joseph Smith borrowed and utilized Adam Clarke's commentary.
It was it was known for a couple of years before it was published. So it wasn't until it was published that people could examine the evidence. So Adam Clarke's commentary deals mostly with textual issues or translation issues. So it wouldn't have bothered me in the least if Joseph Smith had learned something from one of the many commentaries that were available in that time, including Adam Clarke's. If he had learned something from that was a better way of looking at the text or something like that, why not? But it didn't but it didn't happen. So for me, this wasn't an issue. It was not an issue of trying to somehow defend the faith or be an apologist to do this. I just examined all of the ones that were invoked, and none of them work, in my opinion.
And was there anything that motivated you to look at all of the connections? Because I think for most people, you're just like, right, they've done an article, they found all these correspondences. Who really wants to look at every single correspondence they've done between Adam Clarke's commentary and the JST? Like, I know some critics were, you could say, maybe weaponizing or using their findings to say that Joseph Smith was plagiarizing and borrowing from the JST, right, sort of undermining inspiration. Was any of that a factor, or were you just like, I've written books on Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, so I just want to look at it for myself?
I was in the process of doing my own research on some Joseph Smith translation projects. And so, like I said, I had known about it for a couple of years, and in the process of doing my own research, I wanted to look into it more carefully. And so that's why I got into it and started looking at it. I had actually written in an article, I'd actually mentioned that Joseph Smith got some ideas out of Clarke's commentary. I wrote that before I even looked at it, and I wish I could take that publication back because it was not accurate. So once I started to look closely into it, I found that there was nothing there. You're right that critics of the church jumped on this, and it was they just thought that they had found the bullet that destroys Joseph Smith as a prophet. And I think the project was a good faith effort on the part of Professor Wayment to examine these sources. I just don't think it works, and I'm totally convinced that not a single one of the 30 or so passages that he invokes can be sustained as coming from, in any way, from Adam Clarke's commentary.
Right. So you didn't do this because you didn't see this as a threat against Joseph Smith being inspired in his revision of the Bible or being a prophet. It was more just, let's examine the evidence in the correspondences. And your article addresses their 30 top or strongest correspondences, and you go through each one. So it's not that you're picking some of the weakest ones, you're going through their 30 strongest correspondences in that article.
Correct. Those are actually the 30 that they that Wayment published in 2 articles. And I looked at every one of them. If someone wants to read my article, read the first part of it and then read the conclusion, because the individual examples are pretty tedious, but I don't think a single one of them shows evidence that Joseph Smith ever looked at Adam Clarke.
Yeah, and I actually read through your article. I was like, I don't want to take your word for it. I want to read every single one. And, there's maybe one or two where I could understand them thinking maybe an influence, but the vast majority, I think you showed very definitively and conclusively that it's maybe a word here or there, or it's not even identical to Adam Clarke's commentary, and there's a better explanation either from logic or him, utilizing the Book of Mormon. Do you want to maybe give maybe two or three examples, if you can, that you think were quite weak correspondences that they showed?
Um, no, I would just refer your readers to your link so that
Yeah.
they can
Oh,
find
that's
it.
fine. Well, there's one here that because I actually have the article up. It's in the King James Bible. It's whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause, and in Joe Smith's translation of the Bible, it omits without a cause. It's whosoever is angry with his brother. And I think Adam Clarke's commentary points that out. But you also point out that that is omitted in the Book of Mormon as well. And then I think like there was another one I read about him changing. What was it? It was one of the first ones. Oh yeah, Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you is what's in the King James Bible, but the JST changed it to Pharaoh will not hearken unto you. And Adam Clarke criticizes that it should be will instead of shall. But then you pointed out that in so many passages before, Joseph Smith was already changing shall to will. So it seems more logical that he's already doing it. So why point to Adam Clarke as the source for that? And you go through each of them. So I recommend listeners to go through it.
There are several examples like that where the prophet had already made that kind of revision on several occasions before he got the one that Adam Clarke suggested, showing that Joseph Smith did not get the idea from Adam Clarke.
And whenever this research was first presented, it seemed really much like this is direct borrowing. It's very conclusive. It's that he has been reading and copying passages from Adam Clarke, and I had just accepted it. And then as you look through the 30 correspondences, it just seems unlikely that he even read it, let alone was copying like a word here or there. Like it reminded me a little bit of the arguments of Joseph Smith borrowing from the late war, the first book of Napoleon, because there's some phrases here which match up with things in the Book of Mormon, but then it doesn't acknowledge the ellipses and just all the differences, and it just seems so improbable that Joseph Smith is going through these texts and taking a few words out here or there.
Correct. And here's another thing: if Joseph Smith is going to borrow these tiny little inconsequential suggestions from Adam Clarke, why didn't he borrow any of the good stuff? Adam Clarke was a bright guy who had much good to say, and yet none of those are in the Joseph Smith translation. The whole process again just does not work. It didn't happen.
Yeah, so I would encourage people to read through them all yourself and come to your own conclusions. But I definitely came away not thinking I was convinced that Adam Clarke was utilized, and at a stretch, you could say that possibly he'd read it in the past and then could have triggered some things. But even then, it doesn't seem like there's any evidence for that. There's been a recent article by Colby Townsend that he's done on Adam Clarke showing up in the Book of Mormon. I know you've done a recent response to this, but what if someone were to say that when you argue that some of the changes in the JST that Joseph Smith is, using the Book of Mormon, but what if some of those Isaiah passages or certain verses in the Book of Mormon are in fact being influenced by Adam Clarke?
Yeah, Townsend's article, what he tries to establish in his article, very, very unsuccessfully, in my opinion, is that Joseph Smith, first, it works like this. So first of all, it's an angel in 1 Nephi 13 says that plain and precious things were removed from the scriptures. So Joseph Smith, in inventing and authoring the Book of Mormon, according to this author, when he comes to Isaiah passages, he restores plain and precious parts by means of the revised Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon. The problem with it is that not a single one of those works. I mean, this was terrible scholarship, in my opinion, and none of them restores plain and precious anything. And so when Joseph Smith is doing the Book of Mormon, however the authorship of the Book of Mormon came about, and however the translation was made in effect, there are differences in Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon from their source text, the King James translation. Almost none of those differences are interesting in any way, but Townsend wants to claim that Joseph Smith revised those based on Adam Clarke in order to fulfill the angel's wish that plain and precious things be restored. That's not a good piece of scholarship, in my opinion.
And this would only apply really to the Isaiah chapters of the Book of Mormon? And maybe the Sermon on the Mount, or is it just the Isaiah chapters?
Just the Isaiah chapter. In that particular article, in Townsend's article, it's just about the Isaiah chapters in the Book of Mormon.
Right. So you don't see any strong connections to Adam Clarke being utilized in the Isaiah chapters in the Book of Mormon?
No, not even close. None at all.
And do you think there's any possibility to their theory that, okay, Joseph was not borrowing or copying from Adam Clarke's commentary? Do you think it's possible he could have had it, maybe read it in the past, and maybe some things were subconsciously remembered in his Bible revision? Or do you think there's nothing to Adam Clarke?
There's nothing to Adam Clarke.
Wow. And do you have any thoughts why there was such a strong endeavor being made to tie Joseph Smith's translation to Adam Clarke when the connections just seem very weak?
I think when Professor Wayment started working on this, he looked at a lot of sources, a lot of contemporary English language sources. And so he didn't just look at Adam Clarke. He was trying to find if Joseph Smith was influenced in any way by any of the religious literature at the time. So he looked at various sources, and he ended up concluding that Joseph Smith was influenced by Adam Clarke. Now, Adam Clarke's commentaries are very philological, meaning they deal a lot with words and how words are used and things like that. So in the process of that, you're going to find some convergences with something, but they're random and they don't work. But Professor Wayment's publications, I think, were really adopted with joy by critics of the church, and many critical podcasts of the church ran with it, and of course used the word plagiarism, which Wayment never used and never suggested. And so that became kind of a happy trope for critics of the church, and probably continues to the present.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an exaggeration, misrepresentation, and like you pointed out, sometimes it's just a word here or there. And from looking at what you've your refutation in your article on their 30 strongest correspondences, I don't see any weight at all to the Adam Clarke connection. I think we need to stop people to bringing that up, this claim. And again, you pointed out that this was not an effort to defend the faith or defend Joseph being a prophet or being inspired. Even if you took the view that if it's not inspired, he wasn't a prophet, from an evidence point of view, there's no connection to Adam Clarke's commentary.
Right.
Okay, well, maybe we can finish then with just some rapid fire questions for myself or some listeners on the JST, and you can just give quick responses. One listener asks about your thoughts on passages about Melchizedek in the JST. Do you know what he means by that?
In Genesis 14, we have revelation of new text that deals with Melchizedek, and it's a wonderful addition. And it tells us of Melchizedek's career, creating a community essentially like Enoch's that eventually was taken into heaven like Enoch's community. So yeah, that's a really happy new revelation that we can be glad that we have in the Joseph Smith translation.
So one criticism that's brought up is that Joseph Smith added a prophecy of himself in Genesis 50. It talks about, a choice seer from the loins of Joseph of Egypt. His name shall be called Joseph, after the name of his father. It does seem to echo language very similar to 2 Nephi 3, which claims to be a prophecy from the brass plates. But what would you say to that? Joseph Smith is just writing himself into the Bible, even if it was probably not on the original text.
If Joseph Smith wanted to write himself into the Bible, he could have done a much better job than he did. So that convinces me that he wasn't trying to write himself into the Bible. But this is an interesting case because there is a clear overlap from Lehi in, what is that, 2 Nephi 3? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think so.
And the big change that's added in Genesis chapter 50. But they're not exactly the same text, but there's a clear overlap. The JST starts with, so there's a big addition in the Joseph Smith translation about a future, about the coming of the Messiah, and about Moses, and about a future second Moses person who's clearly Joseph Smith. And so we have about 200 words of new text in the Joseph Smith translation. And then we have about 500 or so words of, and then the next 500 or so words overlap with what Lehi is teaching his son Joseph. And those overlap pretty well. They're not identical. There are phrases in them that are identical, but they're not identical. And then the JST edition ends, but Lehi quotes more from the same source, but something that's not in the JST. So it seems to me that what we have is two different versions of a common ancient source, one that gets passed down somehow to Lehi and his family, and the other gets restored through the prophet Joseph Smith. It's a very interesting case.
So this is one question I had whenever I was a missionary, and I've heard different apologetics for it, but I remember reading the Sermon on the Mount, and there was a verse, I'm just going to paraphrase it, but Jesus says something along the lines of, men in that day will cast out, demons in my name and do many mighty, wonderful works, and then I'll say to them, I never knew. And in Joseph Smith's translation, he changes that to you never knew me. But then I remember encountering in the Book of Mormon that it had the I never knew you in the Book of Mormon. And that kind of puzzled me at the time, because I was like, oh, the JST revision is a inspired change of an incorrect version of that verse, but why is the incorrect version in the Book of Mormon? How would you answer a criticism like that?
I wouldn't view it as a criticism. I would view it as an observation. But it is in fact true. This is very interesting. When Joseph Smith gets to Matthew chapter 5 in the Joseph Smith translation, he realizes he already had a version of that in 3 Nephi in the Book of Mormon. So Matthew chapter 5 in the Joseph Smith translation reproduces the equivalent chapter in Jesus' teaching in 3 Nephi. So the Matthew 5 in the JST is the 3 Nephi telling of Matthew chapter 5. But he doesn't do the same with Matthew 6 and 7 that are also in 3 Nephi. So he, in the JST, changes chapter 6 extensively, changes Matthew chapter 7 extensively, without reference to the Book of Mormon. But it's very clear to me that he revises chapter 5 of Matthew in the JST in light of the Book of Mormon. Now, why did he do that? I don't know. We have no way to provide cross-examination from Joseph Smith on this. I don't know why he did it, but it's true that in some cases it reads one way in the Book of Mormon and otherwise in the Joseph Smith translation.
And do you think it's possible that that is what Jesus said, as in, I never knew, but this is speculation, but maybe Joseph is giving us an alternative meaning of what that could also mean, but perhaps that is what Jesus said, and that's what we see also reflected in the Book of Mormon?
Good question. I don't know what the answer to that would be, and that same kind of question could be asked in with respect to other passages as well.
Another passage is, people point to Luke chapter 10 verse 22, and critics would use this to support that this shows that Joseph Smith had a modalistic or Trinitarian view of God. I have here, so this is the JST version. All things are delivered to me of my Father, and no man knoweth that the Son is the Father, and that the Father is the Son, but him to whom the Son will reveal it. How do you make sense of that verse? Because it does sound at least confusing, and critics might say it sounds like modalism.
Yeah. It's obviously an outlier, and when we engage in interpreting the scriptures and we find something that doesn't seem to mesh with the rest, we need to view it in light of other passages. It's very clear in the Joseph Smith translation that Jesus and the Father are not the same being. They're not the same person. That is made abundantly clear, and Joseph Smith made that abundantly clear in his own teachings as well. So for some reason, that passage gets revised to emphasize their oneness. And you and I can understand their oneness in a different way from how Nicene Christians understand it in light of the creeds and councils. So I just say Jesus in that particular verse was reminding his audience that when people see him, they're seeing what the Father would say and do were he among them.
I suppose contextualizing as well, the Book of Moses chronologically was translated earlier, but as I've read through the Book of Moses, it very clearly distinguishes the Father and the Son. You know, Moses' vision of God, and he refers to his only begotten Son. And then in the pre-existence, you have the Father and the Son conversing with each other as well.
Correct.
So there's other passages, and Doctrine and Covenants 76 and others, which definitely do not sound modalistic.
Correct.
Okay. This is one question I have, and I wonder if, hey, there he is.
What happened?
I don't know. You magically showed up.
I suddenly appeared.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so disappointed, but it's nice that we get to see your face then. It makes it more personal.
Just in time to say goodbye.
Yeah, just time to wrap up. Well, here, I've got one question. This is sort of a question that I have. I've listened to a lot of, debates between like atheists and theists, or, against the Bible. And often some of the passages on, genocide, or some troubling passages on slavery are pointed to. Did Joseph Smith ever engage with those passages? And one might ask, like, why not? Because they might seem like important passages to, give an inspired revision to, because particularly people who are Bible-believing Christians, it can cause a lot of people to lose faith in the God of the Bible.
You mean, for example, like in the book of Joshua, when they're conquering the Promised Land and things like that?
Yeah.
No, I think, but that raises what I think is an important question. And the question is, why did the Lord want him to do this and not this? And the answer is we don't know. But I would say that the emphasis was not on historical events from the Old Testament. In fact, there's almost no change in any passages that deal with the historical events in the Old Testament. but instead revealing doctrinal truth. And so we have a great deal of emphasis in Genesis, mostly restoring doctrinal information, then a great deal of information in the Gospels. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and Genesis make up more than 2/3 of the pages of the Joseph Smith translation. So that was the great point of emphasis. And so I think the interest was in doctrine rather than in these other things. So I would love it had the Lord revealed to Joseph Smith some kind of discussion about what the Israelites were doing in the conquest, wiping out whole peoples, or even if those stories are historically accurate. But alas, we have what we have, which is a testament of Jesus Christ more than anything else.
And you said at the beginning that it might be an incorrect assumption or view that many of us have had, that as he's going through the Bible and making inspired revisions, that he's restoring the ancient text or what was originally on those texts. But that could be true in some cases, but he's harmonizing, he's modernizing, he's incorporating things from the Book of Mormon and his own revelations, or providing context. So it's not always that he is restoring what was on these ancient biblical manuscripts.
Correct, to the extent that we can answer that question, and our ability to do so is very limited. And it may well be that the book of Judges, as we have it in the Bible, accurately preserves the story as it was told to the author of the book of Judges. That may or may not be how it exactly happened in its original context.
Okay, so this is a speculative question, but do you think the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible could ever be canonized? And would you like to see it canonized, or do you not think it's necessary?
Fortunately, that's not a decision that you and I get to make, right? But
maybe one day for me. No, I'm just kidding.
But we already have the best stuff in our scriptures. I think that the best material in all of the Joseph Smith translation is what we learn in what we call the Book of Moses, which is an excerpt of the first 6 chapters of Genesis from the Joseph Smith translation. And then the real JST gem of the New Testament, in my opinion, is Joseph Smith Matthew, which explains the second coming of Jesus in such simple, clear language that teaches us how we want to behave in preparation for the second coming and what we can expect. So we've got the good stuff. In addition to that, in the 1979 edition of the King James translation that the church published, the decision was made to include footnotes that have some of the best excerpts from the Joseph Smith translation, with longer excerpts in the back. That has been refined since then substantially in the 2013 edition, and then in the languages other than English in the church. We now have a Portuguese LDS Bible and a Spanish LDS Bible, and every language in the world where we have Latter-day Saints has, at least online, has access to all the major changes of the Joseph Smith translation. So we're in good shape in terms of having that available to us.
I do agree with you there. I think the Book of Moses is definitely the highlight and the best part of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, which we do have in our canon of scripture, as well as Joseph Smith Matthew. Is there any other important points that you want to say about Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible? We've covered most of my questions. Any other important points, or guess what have you found most valuable in studying this, probably more than anybody, as deeply as you have?
Well, you and I have talked today about the process of how it was created, and I don't want any of your listeners to think that that's what it's about, because it's not. The Lord does endorse the project in very strong language. We have something like a dozen passages in the Doctrine and Covenants where the Lord says things like build Joseph Smith a house so he can translate in it, build a printer shop so we can print it and get to work on it and things like that. So the Lord endorses the product, and we should too. For me, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the two major things that we need to know about the Joseph Smith translation are that it's a testament of Jesus Christ, which is very, very clear. One of the last chapters in my book on the JST deals with how the Joseph Smith translation deals with Jesus Christ. And it's impressive to me that the Lord uses the JST as a vehicle to make very clear the mission of Jesus Christ and who he was. And then the second thing, as I mentioned earlier, is the antiquity of the gospel. I think that's the great revelation in the Joseph Smith translation, that the gospel was had from the beginning. That doesn't mean that people have had it all the time since that time, but it means that it was revealed at the beginning and at other times in human history. And the gospel of Jesus Christ is and always was the only means of salvation in the end. So those, to me, are blessings that I see in the Joseph Smith translation. And the more I have dug into it, the more I am impressed that this is indeed a prophetic work, that Joseph Smith was called of God to do it, and that as we immerse ourselves not only in it, but in the other restoration scriptures, that our lives are greatly blessed.
I love that. Well said. Well, Ken Jackson, thank you so much for coming on and doing this interview and all the great scholarship and work that you've done. I think this has been an important topic for me to finally get around to and to address. I'll probably do a subsequent episode myself where I'll quote a lot of that article you've done on Adam Clarke's commentary, but I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and good evening where you are and good morning where I am here.
Yes, yeah, it's evening time now. And I also just encourage people to check out your two books. So this one here, the Book of Moses and the Joseph Smith translation. I'll put a link where you can get it on Amazon. This one as well, Understanding Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, and that good article you've done on Interpreter addressing Adam Clarke as well. I just appreciate all the great research and scholarship you bring, as well as your faith and testimony as well. And listeners,
thank you.
Thank you. And listeners who've been watching, if you've enjoyed this video, give it a like and comment, share. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future interviews with scholars like Kent as well. And I also would recommend sharing this as well, because I think we need to get sort of his work and the scholarship on the Adam Clarke controversy out as well, and to address this as well. But I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.